Few people had heard of the small American settlement of Ferguson, population 22,000, until the 9th of August 2014. That was the day when Michael Brown, an 18-year-old African American, was shot 6 times by police in the predominantly black township. His death caused violent clashes between the police and protesters. At the funeral, held under a heavy police presence, following many days of violent protest, Reverend Al Sharpton berated those who had rioted after the teenager's death. However, the American police also suffered sustained criticism for arresting dozens of demonstrators and using heavy-handed tactics. Despite all this national attention, it remained unclear why Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot the black teenager, had taken such fatal action. Hardly surprising then that his actions have increased racial tensions between the black community and Ferguson's mostly white police department. Michael Brown's death has reignited the debate about race and police brutality. Civil rights campaigners have claimed institutionalized racism. And indeed, it's true that 6 out of 10 African Americans do not believe that his death will be investigated or handled fairly. So why did the police shoot this African American teenager 6 times? Are they institutionally racist? And what does all this mean for American society? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began by testing the public's opinion about the extent to which they felt that America's history had been influenced and affected and been involved in racism and discrimination. Here's what they said.
I think it's pretty unjust. Typically, as an African American, I mean, you just hear about how it's been so hard for us to move forward as a race and not have to worry about prejudices, whether it's like school or work or whatever.
My considered opinion, which doesn't really have that many statistics behind it, we could say an underclass, probably due to the under-endowment of black colleges, glass ceilings. Oh yeah, real, definitely real. The really blatant redlining and blatant gerrymandering, probably not too black-focused, more Democrat-focused. If you're in Florida, what's the difference?
I mean, if we're starting, slavery would be a great start for that. Discrimination has continued throughout history ever since then. I mean, it's set up a standard in the U.S. where I feel like no matter where we step from here, it's always going to have a level of discrimination because we've had it from the start, from the time the country was founded.
Well, we've always had segregation in the United States, ever since the 60s on, and it's been a continuing issue in our country ever since then.
I feel like they used to be heavily discriminated against, but as time goes on, it becomes less and less, but I feel like it'll always be that very little bit in the world.
Well, it's a history of treating someone like a person, and that's somehow being controversial. So as soon as we started treating someone like a person, that's when racism started.
I think there's a very prominent history of discrimination against African Americans in the U.S. now, our past, and current, and it will be in our future.
Well, it's harder for them to get jobs, to get houses, pretty much anything that white people could have, black people couldn't get as easily.
I guess it all starts with slavery as maybe the most notable first part of discrimination against black people. So I think that a lot of things that are happening even now kind of go back to that, and even if people don't, admit that there's racism now, that I still think that there's kind of there's ideas that started then that are still existing today.
Okay, I feel like the history against discrimination of African Americans starts from way back when, past the 1800s. It's when we migrated here from Africa, and they used us as slaves for housework, house duties, plantations, and all that other stuff, and it slowly transgressed into segregation in the 60s and stuff like that, the Malcolm X movement, Black Panther movement, and all that other stuff. and that was like around the 80s, I guess. It started to get better, air quotes. But I feel like it's not exactly the same as it was back then, but it hasn't changed that much if you really look between the lines.
So it does seem there is a general acceptance that racial discrimination has played a significant part in the history of America. We asked our experts to expand on what actually happened in that history.
African Americans had a long and tragic history of facing white supremacy and racism within the United States. Ever since freedom from slavery, we've seen constant battles against race discrimination and prejudice that have led African Americans to be third-class citizens in a so-called first-class democracy. Institutional racism is rife, particularly within the criminal justice and penal system, and within that, the police brutality that is meted out to African Americans is comparable to anything that we see in the apartheid state, maybe not on scale, but certainly in terms of severity. And therefore, we've got a real problem of culturally ingrained racism within the very social, economic and political fabric of the United States, notwithstanding the fact that they've got a black president. But if you're driving a faulty car, then the best driver in the world cannot improve its performance. And that's my analogy for President Obama.
In America, it goes back to slavery, when you had a couple of 100 years of situations where black people were not even seen as human beings, and then it carried on even after the end of slavery, officially 1865. That carried on in a number of different ways. And then when you had the civil rights movement in 1964, 65, it still found a way to kind of persist and manifest itself.
Let's turn to that fatal shooting in Ferguson. We invited the American public to speculate on why they thought the police had shot an unarmed African-American teenager 6 times. Here's what they said.
We're talking about Ferguson. That would be a failure of anger management and also way too much adrenaline, and police, well, they watch movies too. They really should have done that live action video training thing.
I can't explain why a police officer would do that. It's your right to protect the people, and that's not protection, obviously. But everybody is different, and maybe he had his preconceived notions of whatever this teenager was doing, but he had a life to live just as the police officer did. So if it's your right to protect the citizens, then that's what you should do. You shouldn't shoot a teenager to death. A teenager to death.
Zero empathy. There is zero regard for that person as a human. They think of it more as a statistic, which is sad. They think of him as a suspect, a large suspect, and an African-American suspect. That means that one person by himself, even with the killing force, they're more likely to go immediately to the lethal option. Because the man was equipped with a pepper spray and taser.
I'm not too sure, but I mean, it's more of like, maybe it's what they kind of expected from them. They're scared. It's what society makes them believe. What society makes anyone believe, like these social roles, social definitions. And I mean, most people in America do have like this racism deep down. Like they have beliefs. They have definitions that they believe, even though anyone can do anything.
I don't know. Maybe abuse of power, maybe a power trip. I don't know. I don't know if they had a reason to.
My response, I wish, could just be because police suck at doing their job and because they're afraid of intimidating people. But I also would probably say that there's a lot of confusion when it comes to that. I've had interactions with the police officers where it's like they don't really understand what's going on. There's a lot of misleading information that happens. I would like to believe that it's not a discrimination thing, but it's really hard sometimes when you see an all-white police force acting upon somebody that's of color and just view that as non-discriminational. It's just hard.
The police's job is to protect and serve, but sometimes people make mistakes, and I don't know the full story of it, but now they're looked down upon because of that.
I think that it's probably has a lot to do with just the very fact that from the very beginning of American history that there's kind of been this dividing factor between black people and any other sort of race. So I think that you could totally say that it has something to do with just kind of like that segregation that still, it's around today, and I think that's a great example of it.
Not surprisingly, a range of answers, but no certainty. We asked our experts to share what we do know about events on that fatal day.
The police in America have got a record of being trigger happy when it comes to young black men. They always perceive a threat, even when no threat exists. They always go in with overwhelming force, which is usually deadly. And we've seen time and time again, both with black men and black women in America, being subject to this overwhelming force. Deep in the psyche of white police officers is a tremendous fear and dread of black people, both in terms of what they think they're physically capable of, in terms of their own stereotypes about superhuman black people, but also because of their deeply ingrained prejudice, which leads them to view black people through the prism of racism that designates them as criminal, super criminal, or mad or bad, and usually a combination of the both.
A number of reasons. It could be because they saw the black man as less than a white man. It could be because they have a stereotypical view of what black men represent and he was in fear of his life, even though the man was 20 feet away from him or whatever. And also it could be the fact that when this has happened in the past, they've not been punished effectively.
Many claim that the US police force has a bad reputation around the world. We asked the American public to speculate on why this might be so. Here's what they said.
I believe so, because there are many instances where there, African American, youth being shot by cops.
Because of events like this popping up, and there's not even a time between them. It's like this happened here, this happened there. It's all in a 3-month span, So it's like, how are these police officers being scanned before they are given a gun? Are they being tested as to see where their mind is as far as racism and things like that? Because ultimately, police are supposed to keep the people from harm. But if the police officers are doing the harm, it's what's the point of even having police officers if they're just gonna be cruel to people?
I think that people see the kind of discrimination that they have on crimes, and they don't really respect them because of that.
If you look at media, look at movies, most of them are everyone in the police force are pretty much people who couldn't make it to the army, couldn't make it to big jobs, couldn't even get through college. That's what media says a lot of times. And now with media all over the place, we see pretty much only the bad stuff nowadays. Who wants to have the good news?
Because they put themselves on a pedestal. They feel as though that they can get away with it just because they're the police.
Well, partially because we like to pursue things that are unimportant. I would believe drugs would be an unimportant thing that we like to invest all of our money into and pursuing. When other countries pursue more, important things. And I think that our police force likes to waste their time. And I think that people see that.
They have a bad reputation because I feel like that part of the world is more heavily discriminated than other parts.
So a range of theories and views there. What does the objective data tell us about why American enforcement agencies may have a bad reputation abroad? Here's what our experts said.
The US has a bad reputation in the wider Western world because of their complete disregard for black people, for Muslims, for ethnic minorities within the United States, for its treatment of poor communities, be both black and white, that have an overwhelming response from the criminal justice system. There are people in jail serving 20, 30 years for the most minor of crimes. And therefore, crime and criminal justice in America has lost its credibility because of its overwhelming propensity to discriminate against poor people, black people, and other minorities.
The US police force has a bad reputation because they have a long established record of killing or harming black men, even if they're unarmed and no threat to the police officer concerned. There's many examples of that happening.
On the same theme, it seemed natural to ask the public if they felt the US police were institutionally racist. And why is there a lack of trust? Here are their answers.
I think in certain places they are institutionally racist. I don't think it's everywhere. I think in I don't know, I guess they profile based off of the area that they live in. If in a higher poverty rates where a lot of African Americans live in, they They're a little racist there.
I think in terms of trying to get certain statistics that it could be, because if they're trying to hit a certain number a quota every month or every year, that it almost seems like they might have to. It might not be direct, but indirectly they might be institutionally targeting specific races, especially black people.
I would say yes. I would say up the board, it probably just is created just like any other thing. Like, there's a level of discrimination that just exists when you have power, I feel like. And I don't think that it's a black or white thing. I just think that discrimination exists as a whole, whether it be from a black male or a black woman discriminating against a white person or the other way around. I think it just happens to be that police generally seem to be more white. And I think it's like 80% of police force I've read is like white. And I think that just creates a level of discrimination because you give these people a gun and power, and what do you expect to happen?
Not intentionally, but I think it's more of as a societal thing. Back to like the social definitions, racial definitions, it's what society defines. It's like how they have gender roles, how women are supposed to do one thing, like cooking and everything, while guys are supposed to like action. It's just definitions made by society, which controls our lives and affects how we act.
The lack of trust to the police is because they're not serving their interests. You know, it says to protect and serve. The question is who? And right now, like Ferguson, for example, they're not even, like, the question is, who are they protecting? And the only thing you can really say is, again, that community of the police, rather than the community of the community of the people, rather.
Lack of, I guess, knowledge or like communication barriers between the two. They don't really like give us the right information.
People like him, that's why there's lack of trust and personal experience, because as an African-American teenager myself, I can say that I've experienced stuff like that. I saw one of my friends get beat in front of me walking home from school because a police officer chased him and he was not resisting the officer, he got beat. So it's personal experience. I've seen these things.
Because I feel like as more crime happens, trust is lost, and once trust is lost, you can't really get it back that easily.
Lack of trust in the community, that's a hard one. Going back to the Mike Brown situation, am I going to be the one to get shot if I'm walking down the street late at night and I'm unarmed? Like, it's just a matter of what's going to happen. Like, other police, when they show up, are they going to protect you or are they going to harm you? So you just don't know what kind of police officer you're going to get, kind of.
Perhaps particular events or reasons are driving the change in attitudes towards the American police. We asked our experts to share their opinions about these factors.
There's a very famous saying in the civil rights movement in America: where there is no justice, there is no peace. It comes from a lengthy speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King and was reiterated and picked up in the 80s by Reverend Al Sharpton. And it remains true today, because the corrosive effect of racist discrimination against African Americans leads to an erosion, a corrosion of the democratic principle of the belief in the equality of the rule of law, and that all people are treated equally before the law. And where that comes under question and under threat because of racism, then the state loses credibility, social cohesion breaks down, and conflict will often and does often arise.
Yes, the police are institutionally racist. The reason for lack of trust is that time and time again, when the police have a chance to arrest or apprehend a young black man without injuring him, they choose to injure him or kill him. So the community has just had enough of it.
The police shootings, the African American deaths, and the riots these provoke have all been broadcast around the world. What does this mean for American society and for social cohesion? The public said this.
I think by like broadcasting the issues, like I feel like it's bringing everyone like closer together, because like they're all like seeing how messed up like it is, and like they want to like fight like for it and stuff.
I don't think it's helping, but I think it might bring together the race, but in the wrong way, to like more establish the prejudices instead of tear them down. So I don't think it's actually having a positive effect.
Well, it means being embarrassed as a tourist when you go abroad.
Everybody's coming together to fight a cause.
It just gives all the other nations a reason to put us down, saying how we're not the top, we're not the most equal. It's just a way, it's just like, it's all about politics now. and how we're trying to get into everyone else's business. Another country could use that against us, saying, how can you try to change us if you can't even change yourself to an actual democracy?
Well, I think it's gonna sound stupid, but like maybe a race war, potentially. Because, I don't know, everybody feels as though they gotta look out for their best interests.
I think it means there's going to be more pressure on the United States to do something about this, to like bring people together, I guess. I don't know.
I feel like it's bringing certain cultures together while it's splitting those cultures away from other cultures. So we're slowly diversifying culture by culture away from each other.
Clearly, the American people would like the reputation of their law enforcement services to be positive. Is this possible? What are the real implications of all this for the unity and the stability of America's communities? As ever, we gave the last words to our experts.
All over the world, we're seeing in what I call neoliberal democracies this crisis of legitimacy of the state, whether it's because people are now refusing to vote, even with the partisan offer in places like the United Kingdom and Europe. We see voter turnout, registration and participation falling as people move to the right and become less enamored with the democratic process. We see the rampant sexualization of children through capitalist commercialization of products of every type and demeanour. We see police officers and judges falling into the trap of expressing prejudice through their judgments, which means that in Europe, in Britain and in places like America, we're seeing a real crisis of confidence that goes to the root of the legitimacy of the state, where it relies upon the premise and the promise of all people being equal before the law. That is not the case in Europe, not the case in Britain, and certainly not the case in America. And the lessons that we've got to learn, unless there's a radical overhaul, making politicians more accountable, making multinationals more accountable, empowering the people to take power, then I think this crisis will continue. And the type of movements that we see from the Occupy movements throughout the Western world will rise up and continue to rise up again and again, as long as this inconsistency of Western society remains at its heart, that it pledges democracy and freedom for all, but it protects it for the few and it discriminates against the many.
It makes America look very bad. It puts the idea that America is a post-racial society in the dustbin, because how can you have a post-racial society when people are still being killed because of color of their skin? And as far as community relations are concerned, it makes them far more fragile and tense than they should be, because a community is not going to take its citizens being shot and killed on a regular basis and the police officers getting away with murder.
The US has a long and disturbing history of institutionalized racism and police brutality against ethnic communities. Events such as the killing of teenager African-American Michael Brown only serve to highlight the anger and the distrust, all of it broadcast in stark reports around the world. The land of the free, it seems, is imprisoned by its own social and racial divisions. Until it solves those problems, the United States may be doomed to endure social tensions at home and a damaged reputation abroad.